am absolutely delighted to be moderating this panel on the evolution of democratic federalism. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to Tiziana. So our panelists today are Tiziana Stella, and she is Executive Director of the Streit Council for a Union of Democracies. Dr. Stella is a specialist in transatlantic relations, NATO, European integration, US foreign policy, and federalism. She is taught at the University of Tübingen, Germany, and at Moscow State University, and she's going to be presenting the Federalist Wager on Organizing the World Through Democracy. The second speaker will be Philomila Tsoukala. She is a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Her research interests focus on the position of the family in political economies of Western liberal states, as well as, more recently, focusing on the European crisis and the threat of permanent transformation of the European Union through crisis management. Her paper is entitled, "Is Social Europe Possible Beyond the Nation State?" Michael Holm is a senior lecturer in social sciences at Boston University, an esteemed co-organizer of this conference. And his research focuses on US foreign policy, 20th century political history, diplomatic history, and immigration history. He has a 2016 book from Rutledge called The Marshall Plan, A New Deal for Europe. And his paper will be The Other American Dream, Human Rights and the One World Order. So Tiziana Stella, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so today I will talk about an idea. The idea is democratic world federalism that in its present form was born in the 1930s, precisely in response to the problem we're addressing today, the crisis of the nation state and how democracy survives. Because the surge of interest in democratic federalism is mostly due to the impact of Clarence Streit, I will refer to some of his prescriptions which address realist concerns while not embracing the prevailing realist method of simply reinforcing the undemocratic structures of international affairs. Further, they contribute an extra layer to our discussion, specifically regarding the role of democracies. But democratic federalism is not just an idea, an aspiration. It became very much part of the debate in the formation of the present world order. It was considered by the planners as the main alternative to cooperation as model of world organization. In other words, it deeply penetrated the work of post-war planning. I will address the question of why and when the choice was made against federalism and the implications of that choice. I submit that that choice was not a predetermined outcome. Oh God. So is democratic federalism relevant today? I strongly believe so, especially because it was born in response to threats similar to ours, the crisis of democracy and the crisis of world organization. I will make the case that the present crisis of world order, the deconsolidation of democracy in mature democracies, and return to authoritarian forms of nationalism throughout, as well as the reemergence of models of great power competition, restraint without integration, are outcomes of a choice made at the moment of creation of the present order, born out of a tension between two competing alternatives, intergovernmental cooperation and federation. Now, this chart shows a jump in public support for a Union of Democracies just before the war, with 35% of the US population in favor of joining the war as a Union of Democracies. This is very interesting because it rhymes very well with a similar spike of the idea of a world federation anchored to a Union of Democracies in 1917, again at the moment of US entering the war, indicating a persistent aspiration of engagement with the world on terms that would overcome power politics. This aspiration became organized in 1939 through a vast popular movement in the US and other countries. The idea was transnationally embraced during the war as the program of international democracy. This became also the first popular movement that challenged intergovernmental cooperation as unsuitable to carry on democratic values at the international level. This perspective was also increasingly shared by public intellectuals and certain foreign policy elites. Its policy prescriptions were publicly underwritten by members of the Roosevelt's cabinet, of the US Supreme Court, and by some among the post-war planners working with the State Department, again on the basis that this was the only program coherent with the values and processes of democracy. It became also part of a very lively discussion, at times semi-violent, within the legislative branch of government, asking that the US model of engagement with the world be federation. To many, the concept that federalism indeed stood at the moment of creation as a competing idea may come as a surprise. But the fact that there was a tension between the model of federation and that of cooperation at that decisive junction points to a critical opportunity, definitely relevant today at the moment of a re-emerged crisis of democracy and of rethinking of the international order. We are seeing now, on the one side, the declining ability of the global architecture to manage world challenges. On the other, the legitimacy of our order is being disputed by both illiberal and liberal camps. If both of these issues are to be avoided, we may wish to look into what the alternative model of world organization offered. So I want to present here quickly some of the claims of democratic federalist theory. Democratic federalists believe that problems of world organization and those of democracy could not be solved separately. They are but two sides of the same coin. Internal democracy requires reliable international organization that only the operability functions of federalism can provide. But in turn, federalism requires the presence of representative democracy and democratic culture. Democracy, to avoid degeneration, needs to be organized beyond the nation state democratically. Only federalism can provide this. Federalism also re-empowers disenfranchised democratic citizens, eschewing the trap of intergovernmental cooperation that is incompatible with democracy because de facto disenfranchises citizens of their right to deliberate and vote on global issues that are increasingly affecting their lives. The last point is, I think, extremely relevant because it relates to the problem of identity. Federalism bridges tradition and modernity. Local and national identities can be anchored to a new wider identity that is not superimposed, but is facilitated by the democratic participatory processes that allow internal reconciliation of perspectives and their regeneration through common institutions. Democratic federalism grew in the 1930s as a response to the growing consensus on the crisis of democracy and world organization. Among European and American intellectuals and foreign policy elites, there was a consensus on three critical observations that carry a lot of similarities with today. Democracy was in crisis, the nation state had become an obstacle, its tools were increasingly less effective and too costly. Some relinquishment of national sovereignty was out of question, the League had to be reformed. Of these, Streit refuted the idea that democracy per se was in crisis. He countered that it was not a failure of democracy, but a failure of democratic governments to organize democracy internationally. He accused these governments of pitting, with no recourse, one democratic people against another and causing the weaker and newer democracy to turn into dictatorships. Further, an observation that rings even truer today, by failing to unite, democratic governments were breaching the underwritten stipulation at the foundation of their social contracts, the state as a means to the end of further emancipating the individual. On reforming the League, Streit observed that the League to make the world safe for democracy faces now all sorts of projects for reforming it, such projects that are based on the keystone of democracy. He also observed that all reform proposals were based on some exclusivity criteria that blocked the road to universalism, which he believed could be achieved by democratic means only with free men uniting. So he proposed a path from nationalism to universalism, an open federal nucleus of democracies whose traits would enable it to lead to democratic world government. This idea became the shared aim of the World War II federalist movements across the world, and it was incorporated in the original treaties of the UN NATO, but I will not have time to go into that. But there was a key question that remained, Streit observed. Why is it that these free states, themselves union of smaller states, do not unite once more to create conditions more favorable to the freedom of their citizens? And his conclusions was that the reason was not selfishness, but a sort of mental confusion that emerged for historical reasons from equating the independence of the state, which is the absolutist goal, with the independence of the citizen, which is the democratic goal, and from forgetting that democratic governments had been instituted as a means to an end, the further emancipation of the individual. This made it counterintuitive for common citizens to grasp that they would gain rather than lose freedom in a democratic union. Again, they tended to equate their freedom with the freedom of the state because of the history of their national democracies. Because this government had de facto breached this unwritten contractual obligation, Streit believed that citizens had the right to transform some of the nation states' function to the bigger federal union, to transfer, sorry. Now, this is perhaps the most important slide, but I'm gonna have to go very quickly through it. Simply, the nucleus union had to be built in such a way, Streit believed, to function as what I call in a metaphor, a political singularity, a breakthrough for cumulative democratic growth leading to a world democratic federation. He considered axiomatic that democracy and federalism had to proceed together in the 20th century. The beginning of world federation had to come first. The traits it needed to have were to be federal, democratic, and open. The union was also conceived as a strategic democratic union, and here we see the deeper realist aspect of Streit's thinking that they are present in his consideration on power and homogeneity. It needed a certain degree of homogeneity, and it needed imbalance of power. Qualitatively different from preponderance of power of classical hegemony. It could yield deterrence and disarmament, and at a lower cost. And it also be beyond collective security, which was not a peace system, but a system for using war as the instrument of collective policy. Now, in this next slide is a fortune poll that shows what is the preference of the American public just before Pearl Harbor, and that preference was to join a Union of Democracies in all parts of the world to keep order. So in this second part, I address the question of why the original consensus on the need of some derogation of national sovereignty shows that just before Pearl Harbor, the most favored option of engagement chosen by the public was through a Union of Democracies. The least liked option was through joining forces with Great Britain to keep order. Interestingly, this was the alternative that had been pushed by the foreign policy elite, including the president. This surge of support was greatly due to the fact that Clarence Streit's bestseller, Union Now, had offered a detailed plan for world organization, and his intellectual work had transformed the previous federalist aspirations of 1917 into foreign policy planning and an autonomous federalist theory of international relations. So we move from World War I aspirations to World War II specific planning, which could catalyze the energies of those internationalists, and for that matter, also anti-interventionists that wanted to change the nature of the international system. Of course, success of the Federalist movement was clearly not single-handedly achieved by Streit. It was because it tapped into a rich vein of American foreign policy that spiked more intensely in moments of crisis and of shifting of the order, both 1917 and 41. On both occasions, the American public and progressive internationalists mobilized, asking for a transformation of the international system. The attractiveness of the proposal is proved further by the fact that just after Pearl Harbor, at the moment of joining the war, members of the Roosevelt's cabinet, the US Supreme Court, and many other prominent figures signed a public petition calling upon the US to join the war as part of a Union of Democracies, a nucleus of world federation, a petition that was, by the way, green-lighted by the administration. So, why did the administration decide to disregard what seemed to be a public preference on the one hand, and on the other, at the end of the war, the administration still felt compelled to defend this choice as a choice against federation? For example, just a few days after the signing of the UN Charter, Secretary of State Stettinius rejected criticism of the Charter's voting provisions on the grounds that they were arising from failure to remember that the United Nations is neither a federal union nor a world government. We will see next that from 1943, planners actively rejected federation, but the persistent relevance of this alternative transpires till the end of the war in the language that they used. Why and when did post-war planners decide against the federative model? Quickly, till the fall of France, federative perspective had a strong impact on official and semi-official visions of future world order. In 1940-41, the option of post-war federative system was explored. Further, the content of democracy as a term used in a practical sense in international matters was investigated. Until the end of 43, records show that there were strong pressures, both internal and external to the State Department, toward favoring some kind of federalized international organization or government. In September 1943, a secret official draft of the UN Charter admitted that two, and perhaps only two, alternatives in basic form of organization were open: the cooperative form and the federal form. Decision was made against federation. The drafting committee decided it was politically not feasible, although theoretically desirable. But concurrently, State Department drafts show that federative structure were not only contemplated, but put forward by planners themselves as superior candidates for effective world organization, proving that federation deeply penetrated foreign policy planning before being eschewed. What I presented, I think, should be more than enough to dismantle the idea that the choice of intergovernmental cooperation was inevitable, as traditional historiography has claimed till now. As such, a different choice suddenly appears much more in the realms of possibilities than we may have thought, especially after witnessing many forms of collapse of international cooperation. It also explains why the US, rather than becoming the agent of a qualitative transformation of the international order, as in the 1917 and 1941 petitions, became de facto the epitome of the perpetual reification of the nation state. The choice against federation was made partially because, as the war progressed, the US realized it could become the arbiter of the new order without shedding any of its national sovereignty prerogatives. With the fall of France, the goal of internationalists switched from that of creating a system that could overcome power politics to one of ensuring military supremacy. This, the planners knew, could be achieved either by federation with a qualitatively different unbalance of power, or by policing the world through a partnership with Britain without curtailing national sovereignty. Toward the end of the war, the preeminent importance of US participation in the war transformed the acceptance of the UN into a quasi-patriotic duty. Countering alternatives were considered destabilizing, shunned as perfectionist, and support was gained on these premises. Democratic Federalists didn't oppose the UN upfront, but kept requesting that an internal Union of Democracies be instituted within the wider UN structures. They also warned against replicating unstable structures wherein collective security could easily break down into a system of perpetual armed conflict, and the US emerged as the national security state we know it today. Just a few weeks after San Francisco with Hiroshima and the bombs, silenced Federalist ideas of an alternative world organization regained currency among the public, and yet the main official line continued to read, "World opinion will not accept the surrender of sovereignty." But here is the counterpoint. What was the actual American public preference on world order? On the one side, we see in the first slide, participation on equal footing. On the second slide, we see willingness to derogate sovereignty. What this tells us is that the American public expressed a preference for a more democratic and just world order than the one that was created, and was not, as the official narrative goes, bent inclined supranational sharing of power. At this point, a different narrative may emerge, one in which World War II was not, as traditional historiography tells us, a time when the main relevant dividing line in foreign policy was that between isolationists and internationalists, but there was also, and over a longer span of time, a divide between federalists and non-federalists, which crossed over the isolationist-internationalist divide. Many isolationists, as they have been called, joined forces with federalists in contempt of the anti-democratic features of the emerging global structures, and contested the claim that the main issue was whether to join, but on what terms and to what end. Had Federalist features been introduced at the moment of creation, a different but not less powerful coalition may have emerged. As such, the fact that intergovernmental cooperation was indeed a choice suddenly becomes a much more convincing proposition and points to a critical opportunity definitely relevant today with a re-emerged crisis of democracy and of abundant calls for a rethinking of the world order.
Tiziana, I'm just going to interject to say we're at time. Can I ask you to wrap up?
Yeah, I have one more thing.
Thank you.
Okay, so here, on occasion of the dropping of the nuclear bombs, journalist Frida Kirchway at The Nation drew the logical conclusion that in the space of a day, the World Security Organization grew from childhood to senility. Now it must be replaced. And it was 75 years ago. My last slide, I chose to conclude with these drawings because they represent a very simple concept, how the unit shapes the end of international organization. They illustrate what Federalists believe to be the main dividing line between progressive and reactionary forces, and the measuring stick when discerning what policies to support in reforming the international system. On the one side, we see the Federalist alternative with the citizen at the center. On the other side, we see the Foreign Policy Association drawing with the government very much on the top. And my last observation is, I also hope that this will help clarify how to sidestep and complement some of the limitations of the many recent revivals of the idea of a League of Democracies. as they continue to confine their prescriptions to a rehash of those of the now under scrutiny liberal international order, an horizontal rules-based system that eschews the vertical dimension of the democratic process, freezing it into the perpetual state of an ever-elusive goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiziana. I'm gonna turn it over to Philo.
Okay, thanks everybody, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. This is truly a pleasure. I will start by acknowledging that the title of the paper I promised is not exactly what I will be talking about. Basically the tide of European and world events over the last couple of years has kind of decided that question for me. Asking whether a social Europe is possible at the current moment seems to me like showing up in California while the fires are burning, inquiring to what variety of grape the wine, the vineyard that just has burnt down should use for the best tasting recolt of the year. In other words, the European question of the moment is much more existential, and it goes far beyond the question of what variety of capitalism the EU will stand for, but whether it will stand at all as a sometimes intergovernmental, sometimes supranational, sometimes sui generis collaboration of nation states for different purposes at different times. EU lawyers like to describe the EU as sui generis to avoid the question of is it supranational, is it intergovernmental? I will just completely set aside that discussion and just say that it seems to be different things at different times for different domains, but the question today is existential for the EU, I think. Paradoxically, that doesn't mean that the question of redistributive politics that social Europe gestures towards is irrelevant. I actually think that it is essential to the existential question in the EU. I just need to say that I'm not going to cabin this discussion to the particular debates about social Europe within the literature of European law. So in terms of the legitimacy of the EU, the traditional discussion has taken place within the framework of input and output legitimacy. Vivian Schmidt has also added the throughput legitimacy, and so alluding to questions of processes through which a specific political entity becomes accepted by the polity. And it seems to me that we are at a moment when, in terms of the legitimacy of the Union, none of these ideas are able to capture quite what's going on, because even if we were to only focus on the output legitimacy, in other words, output legitimacy is the question of whether the policy results desired are achieved, basically, through the processes that the Union puts in place. And even if we were to just take that instrumentalist version of legitimacy, it seems that we are at a moment when the resurgence of nationalism and identity politics on the basis of nationalism make a discussion of whether the EU provides results not just in terms of material goods, but actually in terms of a sense of identity and a sense of belonging that is that provides or anchors legitimacy. So this is my discussion is going to be much looser than I was expecting it to be, partly because I don't want to anchor it in the social Europe literature. What I'm going to do instead is I will discuss here three different recent crises that the EU has been managing or trying to manage, and argue that the question of redistributive politics amongst sovereigns in the EU and between citizens in the EU is repeatedly framed as a question of identity. And the lines are drawn on the basis of a perceived us versus them, drawn on assumed stark, often cultural differences, and also that has gone along, I think, with a resurgence of a politics of law and order and securitization of the borders.
I'm going to talk about the Euro crisis, the refugee crisis, and then the management of this latest coronavirus crisis that we're just dealing with. So in the first crisis, the question of, which is actually the original context in which I started asking myself whether the social Europe is possible at all beyond the nation state. So the question of whether social Europe is possible beyond the nation state actually has its origin even before the Euro crisis era, when due to two different strands of literature in EU law were at loggerheads. On the one hand, you had a literature on soft law and the open method of coordination, which is a way of sovereign states sitting together and coming up with best practices on welfare regimes, essentially. So the literature on open method of coordination assured us that there was a certain level of uniformity in social welfare practices around Europe that could be delivered. So this is a model of basically a loose confederation rather than a federation, to go back to Tiziana's ideas. It presupposes the nation state, a sovereign nation state. The other strand of literature in the social Europe debates was adamant that the EU project was antithetical to European welfarism and bound to destroy it, either by overburdening the welfare states with claims by free movers, as well as diminishing each state's capacity to tax, or because the basic principle of the EU embodied a neoliberal project that was ideologically opposed to the welfare state, one that was indeed structurally bound to undo sovereignty itself, not just in terms of welfarism. Then the Euro crisis hit, and the discussion of social Europe transformed into debates about European solidarity, understood as transfers between sovereigns, the externalities of interdependency, and a highly moralized and punitive discourse about lazy Southerners versus the Protestant ethics of the laboring North. The Eurozone emerged from the crisis with a framework of Euro governance that actually eventually incorporated a lot of the language of social Europe that a lot of the social progressives and the open method of coordination people liked before the Euro crisis. So you have a Eurozone governance framework that adopts some of the language of social Europe, assumes that European states should have a minimum level of protection provided. Many welcomed this as a good development. Others are more skeptical, since the fiscal framework often makes the content of a social Europe an empty promise. So the fiscal straits imposed basically empty out some of the promised content of the language of social Europe that sometimes shows up now even in Euro governance. So the discourse currently, I think, has advanced more to make welfarism part of a promised EU promoted identity. But the contradictions, I think, with the rest of the Euro governance regime, I think, make such language in my personal opinion, almost cosmetic. Okay, so the second instance I wanted to discuss was the refugee crisis, which I think is more accurately described as a sudden political shift in the willingness of Central and Northern European states to accept refugees, rather than a crisis in the sense of a sudden, uncontrollable influx of people. This crisis in 2015 resulted in the infamous agreement with Turkey, which in its essence was an agreement to exchange money for keeping refugees away from the Greek shores, and which helped transform certain Greek islands into buffer zones between the European periphery and the center. So Greece became and other peripheral states, but in that instance, mostly Greece, became the gatekeeper, let's say, keeping away potential asylum seekers and refugees. The debate on intra-Europe solidarity employed in this context was a language of a common identity in the sense of us, the Europeans, versus them, who sometimes were, depending on your political affiliation, sometimes they would be depicted as, simply refugees fleeing violence. In other contexts, political contexts, so they would be depicted as the unknown dark masses coming from the depths of the mysterious and possibly dangerous East. The concrete content of European solidarity in this instance was money for the securitization of the marine and land borders of the EU's external borders in Greece. And I have to say that the contrast between the money flowing to a coalition of the Greek government and NGOs for the management of the refugee flow, and by management of refugee flow, I mean setting up the so-called hotspots, which are, essentially camps. They are open camps, but they are camps. And so there was a coalition of government, money flowing to coalition of government and NGOs for managing that flow. Contrast that with the strict conditionality imposed on Greece as a precondition for not kicking it out of the euro in the previous crisis. That contrast, I think, had a good deal to do with the increase in xenophobic and racist narratives that were already in circulation. I'm not trying to blame Europe for, some of Greece's own problems, but it definitely, the contrast between money flowing to manage the refugees versus money being taken away from hospitals and schools and public services definitely, I think, contributed to a pushing of the polity further towards the right on an identity basis. And here Greece was kind of straddled, right? Because on the one hand, it has to employ the narrative of us, the Europeans, versus them to appeal to solidarity on behalf of its citizens. And on the other hand, it also has to make a distinction between the North and the South in terms of the material conditions that each one is facing. Okay, so another point about the refugee crisis, I would argue that after the last European Parliament elections in 2019, those resulted in broad wins for the right and even extreme nationalist right, with extreme nationalist parties winning in some cases, up to 20–25%. I think that has resulted in some of the discourse of the right and even of the extreme right being adopted by EU institutions themselves. And here I'm specifically talking about the Commission's, the Deputy Commissioner for the Protection of the European Way of Life, which was a position that was established after the 2019 European Parliament elections, which was explicitly which was explicitly associating migration with a danger to a European way of life. Okay, now, third instance that I wanted to talk about, the current coronavirus crisis. Many are observing that the EU seems to have acted quickly, showing practical solidarity based on the common threat that a public health emergency is posing for everyone. The narrative here is rather common humanity versus an alien enemy that is found in the virus. It's a narrative that can can unite everyone and prompt faster responses than a more divisive narrative of an us defined more narrowly. So the 1.8 trillion economic package that was adopted was thought of as a swift response, as was the immediate relaxation of free movement requirements for the purposes of controlling contagion. And here I would say that celebrating this as a step forward for the EU is perhaps premature, precisely because I'm focusing here on the narrative frames that are being used to justify redistributive politics. I would say that we shouldn't underestimate the exceptional character of a public health emergency that allows for a narrative framing that would be more universal rather than particularistic. And on the other hand, we also shouldn't overlook, I think, the elements emerging from these three crises are, the strongest narrative elements of how to frame identity for the purposes of justifying redistributive politics have to do more with a European, at best, a European identity that ends up centering around a civilizational clash as far as the external, like the refugee crisis is concerned, coupled with an intense securitization of the borders of the EU. So this is a set of very inchoate thoughts and observations. I wanted to bring these three instances of crisis management of the EU to concentrate on the kinds of narratives that are being put forward to justify a politics of redistribution. And in conclusion, I would say that I think that we're at a moment where claims of identity are becoming more and more tribal. And maybe perhaps the public health emergency may have provided an instance for hoping that there will be relief from that, because it provides an opportunity for framing an identity that is just humanity at risk of annihilation. But if we're going to be realistic about how that narrative is actually being employed on the ground, we will definitely immediately see differences as between how the public health emergency is managed in regards to the refugee populations being stuck in the hotspots and having nowhere to go, versus the citizens of EU member states that can benefit from the 1.8 trillion package that the EU has put forward. So I don't have this is not a clear argument. It's a set of observations about three crises and trying to reflect about the kind of identity politics that seems to me to be emerging and its potential consequences for redistributive politics. And again, just to go back to one of my initial observations, I'm trying to connect the idea of redistributive politics with the idea of identity itself. Very often in our discussions, the two seem to be put apart. So in other words, some will say, really what matters for building a solid union is a minimum level of material security and safety. And once we get that, then the identity stuff is secondary. I think what our current politics is showing is that the identity stuff is actually predominating, and it's actually providing the central element for redistributive politics between and within member states.
Lastly, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
I entitled my talk, "The Other American Dream, Human Rights and the One World Order." Buried at the back of a classified memorandum from the summer of 1947 appears a critical phrase by the US State Department's Charles Boland. Commenting then on the Soviet Union's rejection of the American proposed Marshall Plan, Boland wrote, quote, "Instead of unity among the great powers on the major issues of world reconstruction after the war, there is complete disunity. There are, in short, two worlds instead of one." The Cold War was effectively a reality. I don't think we should underestimate the regret that certainly the most idealistic Americans experienced. The one world idea represented to the most ideological advocates of the war effort the other American dream. And what I want to focus on today is how that other American dream of a one world order informed American thinking about human rights during the Second World War. More specifically, I want to explore those ideals within the context of American post-war planning and consider their connection to the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I want to finish by considering a few challenges the ideology of human rights faces in a modern world that, to paraphrase the great reporter James Reston, quote, "is full of prejudice and fear and selfish national desires, but has no generally accepted rule of law." Human rights is a challenging issue. One might assume, I think, that an idea supposedly anchored in moral absolutes and law should be straightforward and transparent. but the evolution and protection of these rights has proven slippery. We can trace the origins of human rights to the Enlightenment that culminated in some of the founding documents in France and the emerging United States in the 18th century. Those, of course, were written for a world not yet ready and perhaps not ready still. But there are traces in the 18th century of pain, as well as the French radical Condorcet, as James Miller referred to this morning. But if those ideals failed in their own time, I think it may be, as the sociologist Hans Joas insists, because human rights are best understood as part of a genealogical process. They can't be launched forward as if by torsion catapult. Humanity's perceptions of rights instead has evolved slowly. He detects that in the evolution in the abolition of torture, cruel and unusual punishment, and the emancipation of slaves. Developments that he considered parts of a transformation of tradition that society over time embodied in the general organization of life. Like so many, Joas sees the 1945 creation of the United Nations as a kind of culmination point, much like Paul Kennedy, the historian, does, because that organization's founding, in contrast to earlier international agreements, codified rights in international law. One supposes that that kind of logic leaves room for a certain degree of optimism when it comes to humanity's end destination. Those who are more skeptical often focus on different questions, such as, is human rights a question of texts or one of norms? What's required for human rights to become culturally central in the modern imagination? Are human rights matters of philosophical truths, questions of cultural realities, or reflections of societal development? More provocatively, can you legislate culture? And if there are moral imperatives in this world, how are they resolved at the intersection of culture and absolute rights? Once pursued long enough, what follows from that train of questions, as I'll return to at the end of this talk, is whether human rights are compatible with multiculturalism, a question that raises its own ugly challenges in the world we live in today. As for human rights in general parlance, many view the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights as a seminal moment. The declaration presented a series of supposedly accepted principles and standards that led some to consider it the most important international instrument of the 20th century. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called it the yardstick by which humanity measures right and wrong, and a document that gave people everywhere a powerful tool in the fight against oppression, impunity, and affronts to human dignity. If only it were so. To understand human rights as an international ideal worthy of pursuit, I think the history of American post-war planning from 1945 to 41 to 45 is more persuasive than the excessive poetry we often associate with 1948. But if this earlier period garners this attention, it is likely because the emerging Cold War pushed the US to end up facilitating British and French empires rather than dismantle them. And also because the lofty rhetoric from the war period did not launch the kind of egalitarian world many cried out for after 2 world wars. And I think that combination tempts many scholars to label the American wartime commitment to human rights half-hearted, conservative, if not downright duplicitous. I also think, however, that such conclusions rest on outcomes, not on process or contexts. US planners began the contours of the new global order almost the moment the war began, and that was an effort that drew from the best minds of diplomacy and law and politics. Within both the Roosevelt and the Truman administration, there was an enduring vision that the Second World War could not be a repeat of the first. That is to say that there had to be atonement for Versailles. By way of explanation, I think it's telling that while many scholars then and since sort of hailed the 1941 Atlantic Charter as the first example of a new international order, it was actually an extraordinarily diluted product, not at all the forceful declaration that some of Roosevelt's advisors sought. But if one looks closely, it is clear that American ambitions went well beyond the Atlantic Charter to include a liberal order without empires, but including human rights. Scholars have often dismissed these 3 most outspoken voices on behalf of the administration: Vice President Henry Wallace, former Republican candidate for President Wendell Willkie, and the Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles. I guess they've lost status maybe because all 3 lost their positions over the course of the war. Nonetheless, it's worth noting that they were but the most public voices. but far more than propaganda was at play. To sort of echo Tiziana's comments from earlier, by 1942, you had the American State Department and within the administration beginning a draft constitution for an international order that included a 16-article long Bill of Rights for mankind that called for citizens all over the world to enjoy freedom of religion, speech, property rights, education, procedural rights, and other similar rights from the American founding documents. By 1943, human rights was integrated in the first American rights or draft of what was already called the UN Charter, at least informally. In that context, Wendell Willkie's small book that Manu referenced yesterday, One World, appeared, selling 40,000 copies in its first weekend and 200,000 by the end of the first week. The British ambassador to London cabled back, the book made its readers feel, quote, that America is rising to the height of its material and spiritual power, and that a missionary world task is before the United States, which the nations are eagerly and desperately expecting it to fulfill, end quote. The following year, Willkie further clarified this when he insisted that Americans are fighting a war for freedom. We're fighting a war for men's minds. This means that we must encourage men's just aspirations for freedoms not only at home, but everywhere in the world. That same year, in 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference between the major powers to clarify the early details of what the UN would end up looking like, the US delegation was led by Undersecretary of State Edward Stettinius, and they presented an extraordinarily progressive and aggressive agenda on human rights and social and global economic fairness. This included a plan, quote, to make it the duty of each member of the organization to see to it that conditions prevailing within its jurisdiction do not endanger international peace and security, and to this end, to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms of all its people, and to govern in accordance with the principles of humanity and justice. Subject to the performance of this duty, the organization should refrain from intervention in the internal affairs of any of its members. Effectively, the early American thinking about the UN was an organization in which members' inability to preserve international peace and protect rights could lead to a UN intervention, a far cry from the eventual charter's specific denunciation of such actions. In the end, when the Dumbarton Oaks Conference ended in October of 1944, its formal statement paid only lip service to human rights. Much to the State Department's and to Roosevelt's frustration, the issue was left for another time. The reporter Alan Drury echoed the disappointment that many felt. In his diary after Dumbarton Oaks, he wrote this, quote, out of that big house in Georgetown has finally come the suggestions for a United Nations Security Organization. Such timid minds, so petty and so small, apparently afraid to formulate a really strong world body, they have been content to propose instead a method for organizing international chaos. It is apparently the best the frightened little men who run the world can manage. Still, even if these visions did not materialize, they do provide us a window into the hopes that Americans had for a truly global organization and global values. It was a scenario, of course, that would replay itself the following year at San Francisco, when the UN was formally created. Again, the Truman administration placed human rights at the heart of the matter. Again, only the Americans pressed for a central obligation. The issue was further complicated when the Soviets demanded that the Charter specifically encourage the right to work and the right to education without distinguish to race, language, and sex. While not opposed to such language in principle, Americans were unwilling to only reference these rights because they considered them unequal to political rights. As one American negotiator insisted, given the significance of the American Bill of Rights, he would hesitate to pick out one or two for special mention. In effect, the statute of defined rights had to be either more detailed or less. What we got was the preamble making human rights foundational, but lacking all enforcement mechanism. A deflated Stettinius nonetheless called this the foundation for the economic and social collaboration of nations in the cause of fundamental human rights and freedoms. And he insisted that the drafting of a code of rights should be the first task of the new organization. That never materialized. The vision for human rights described had been born from an American mindset that imagined a liberal, democratic one world order without imperialism and a global economic order that could sustain stability and uplift the less fortunate. that never materialized either. Perhaps the blistering journalist William Henry Chamberlain was right when he labeled American wartime conduct, quote, a depressing compound of profound factual ignorance, naivete, wishful thinking, and emotional hysteria, end quote. Lord Halifax made the same point. The American problem, he argued, is the nation's permanent tendency to believe in declarations and blueprints to cure most of the ills of the world. This naturally leads to a sharp sense of letdown when events refuse to conform to the aspirations of men and of goodwill, and generates amongst them a corresponding tendency to blame the outside world for wantonly putting obstacles in the path of idealistic American statesmen, end quote. Because this American wartime idealism is often misunderstood, it stands in stark contrast to the much-hailed 1948 UN Declaration, even though the latter actually emerges in an imperial world of powerful nation states, and only after the one world hope had been extinguished. Ironically, instead of eclipsed national sovereignty, the Declaration of Human Rights cemented it. As historian James Loeffler points out, in contrast to the popular view that 1948 was established to, or was intended to establish some form of international oversight or authority on the human rights issue, the document guarantees the opposite reality. 1948 was a compromise, not an inspiration. It may protect citizens in theory, but it holds next to no one accountable. If anything, pays the historian Samuel Moyne, 1948 became a justification for state sovereignty. Rather than the grand triumph of a new age, he insists, it was a funeral wreath laid on the graves of wartime hopes. To recognize its impotence, we need only to note that universal human rights played next to no role in politics. Jimmy Carter revived it in the 1970s, inspired practically no popular movements until the same decade, and next to no scholarship until the war crimes of the 1990s. Now, part of the reason for that, of course, was that the Cold War hardly inspired the major powers to advance the conversation. Western Europe was the one bright spot during this period, but in the context of the universal, humanity came up miserably short. What this tells us, I think, is that human rights is reflective of the times and context in which they are discussed. That also means that they are not inalienable and they are not permanent. This likely is a far cry, I think, from how many people perceive the idea of rights, but it may still be an important recognition. Because once we recognize this, the real question, as Moyne points out, is what to do with the progressive moral energy to which human rights have been tethered in their short career. Is the order of the day to reinvest it or to redirect it, end quote. How do human rights fit in a world of rising nationalism, or a world that treats anything suggesting globalization with suspicion? Is there any hope for universal contract, for a universal social contract on human rights? The answers to those latter questions are pretty much separate papers in their own rights. So let me instead here try for the final few minutes to pose and consider a different question. Where does a unifying and universal ideal of human rights fit in a world that increasingly embraces diversity? The problem is not new, but it feels particularly pertinent in our age. In 1947, the American Anthropological Association submitted to the Commission on Human Rights a statement that highlighted what they considered the Western bias of the idea. Any UN-sponsored declaration on human rights, they insisted, will not be convincing to those in Africa and Asia or elsewhere if it rests on the standards of a single culture or is dictated by the aspirations of one single people, end quote. One hears similar rhetoric from those who during the era of decolonization deplored Western arrogance and challenged modernization theory, often with very good reason. And if anything, I think the rejections of the Western historical experience and of Western norms and influence have only intensified. 2020 as well as 2019 saw plenty of that. And I think in that lies one of the core problems of human rights, of the human rights challenge in the 21st century. If human rights are universal, they encompass all of us. If they are universal, they undermine national sovereignty, a problem obviously long acknowledged. But as dramatically, if they are universal, they call for an injection of outside values and ideals, often, though not always, Western-inspired ones, into countries that may not embrace women's rights, LGBTQ rights, the rights of defendants, the rights of children or adolescents and other minorities. Nor could one add to universal rights fit comfortably in nations that embrace the death penalty, outlaw abortion, or deny healthcare as a right. Even among Western states, there is, of course, party agreement on this, and ironically, tragically, the United States is now the chief violator of these latter rights. Some, of course, dismiss this as unproblematic. They see no contradiction between universal human rights and a multicultural world. Boiled down, their arguments is that the rights just listed do not fall under human rights because they do not reflect universally accepted standards. They are not rights, but privileges, in other words. Just about 100 years ago, the United States Supreme Court decided that certain rights were not fundamental, such as the right to a jury trial, but were merely procedural. Is this the status of human rights in the 21st century? If so, who decides what's fundamental? How much power should be ceded to moral relativism? Should we simply wait and hope that the ideals of 1948 trickle down to the present? Perhaps. But justice delayed is still justice denied. Or should we simply water down what we mean by human rights norms? But if so, what's the point? Powerfully, but depressingly, Moyne insists that since human rights, quote, promise everything to everyone, they can end up meaning anything to anyone. As such, it is now difficult to reach an agreement when there is no consensus about how or when or whether to change the world. If cultural proclivities and traditions or religious values trump rights, then those rights aren't actually rights, but they are rather figments of imagination. In that case, rights is merely something we promote, not something we enforce. Again, the United States comes to mind. And so the question is, in a world that's increasingly and often for good reason, advances diversity and multiculturalism, is there still room for a one world dream at the global level? If not, what's the alternative? And where do we go from here, if there indeed is such a thing as a we? And therein, I think, lies the rub. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We have just a little over 20 minutes and questions for all of the panelists. And I thought what I would do in order to try and create as integrated a conversation among the panelists and get in the comments of everyone is I would just read the questions that came for each of the panelists and then let the panelists talk with each other and with us about each of their papers and in reference to these questions as they go along. And so I'm going to defer my own questions and just say, in reference to what Michael just said, this was not a panel of timid minds. It was wonderful collaboration about thinking from a lot of different angles about what kinds of forms of global governance, or maybe even softer forms of global coordination, might be most conducive to creating the conditions of freedom, of equality, of just distribution, of human rights protections of our most human vulnerabilities in a world against a backdrop of profound pluralism. And I'm going to go back to Tiziana's paper and questions from Susan, Brandon, and David there. And sorry. Okay. So the question from Brandon is, when the largest nation in the world is not a liberal democracy, how does this Union of Democracies not simply fall in line with American and European interests? Susan's question, could Tiziana address the European Union project? Does she see the EU as an experiment in democratic federalism? Is Brexit a revolt against democratic federalism? And David's question is, the cooperative model we tried to build is really a network approach to horizontal interstate relations, which means mutual policing. This is the approach that has failed, but despite resurgent populist nationalism, a more supranationalist vision may now appeal to a growing percentage of publics in many democratic nations as the world becomes smaller. Those were the questions directed at Tiziana's paper. For Philo, would you conclude that the EU is losing legitimacy in part because it was ineffective in dealing with these crises? In fact, because it lacks enough centralized power, with open or network coordination not working, with more central control, shared responsibility for solvency and welfare, economic planning, and fair distribution of refugees, and a foreign policy to stop the problems at their source might all become possible. Then faith in the EU would rise at the grassroots level. This is a question from Susan to Philo. Don't you think that both in the management of social policy and in the Euro crisis, the key point is that fiscal policy stays at the national level, so that these are inevitably intergovernmental chapters of the treaties until an EU real fiscal policy is created? And then there was a question from Tad it was about Tiziana's project, but really for anyone else as well, which is why have, and particularly those of us with backgrounds in precisely these areas of political science and international relations, why have we never heard about the history that came out so eloquently in Tiziana's project about serious intellectuals, political leaders, and the general public grappling deeply in the 1940s with the twin possibilities of a union and democracy? And for Michael, why didn't Truman push for a system that could enforce human rights? Was it just because the State Department folks insisted Soviets would not accept it? It does look like Stalin was ultimately the one who killed the possibility for this new world order with human rights and world trade at the center. And Susan asks about Michael's project, were there corporate interests against enforcement at the UN Declaration of Human Rights? Was a social one world seen as too expensive, too many taxes on the elites of the world? And then John asks, isn't the whole point of federalism that it enables management of the commons in the collective interest while respecting diversity? That also directed at Michael. So if each of you can think about the various questions that were asked of your projects, but also think about those questions in relationship to the panel as a whole, I would appreciate it. That's asking a lot, I realize, but we don't have a lot of time. And then I'm gonna go to each of the panelists to address aspects of the questions or each other's papers. And Tiziana, can I start with you?
So the first question, if I remember, was about the failure of the US as being, a liberal democracy that is successful, and similar inclinations also in the EU. My answer would be that this is precisely an effect of the deconsolidation of democracy that happens when instead of creating a stronger core where democracy can actually function and work better, we have the effect that there is a degeneration of democracy because of the lack of instruments of the nation state to actually be able to deal with the problems and the challenges that are there. And so there is this these results, which by the way, has been studied. And on the second question about the European Union, as I see the European Union, well, that was part of one of the points of my presentation that I didn't have time to address. Within the EU and also within NATO, the concept of the nucleus was there, but it was not incorporated as a federalist concept. So we had a double nucleus, a nucleus of countries and a nucleus of functions. And that created this tension of the deepening, widening tensions that as a result bring some of the difficulties that we're seeing today. And then there was a question about why we do not hear much about this different perspective on history. And that I think that there are the cultural model that rejected federation became entrenched and in the interest of the US, and the regeneration of that perspective is considered critical to the maintenance of this order. So it's also considered critical to the maintenance of the liberal international order without reforming such order. Further, if I might say, it's also considered very much in the interest of many of Washington, DC think tanks that then I forgot there was another question that, yeah, the other question was about.
It was about supranationalist vision that may now be more appealing, either despite of or because of, I would suppose, I'm adding that, populist nationalism.
Yeah, and on that I wanted to say that I think that perhaps federalism can provide the instrument of execution for some of these calls that we have for global democracy or for the disenfranchised citizen, and also redirect the malcontent of that we see nowadays in these mass demonstrations, and redirect toward some projects that can bring together both the illiberal and liberal forces to go towards something more positive and constructive.
Thank you so much. Philo, can I go to you to address any aspects of the questions or the other papers?
Yeah, sure. So on the legitimacy question, what the question Susan asked, wouldn't more central control deal with the problems of legitimacy that are generated by the fact that some of the Euro crisis was inefficiently managed, partly because there was not enough central control of fiscal policy? I would say here that there's a very difficult chicken and egg problem, which is that basically the moving of the fiscal policy to the supranational level and the giving of the EU, giving more central control of that to the EU, basically can only be justified on the basis of a narrative of a community, especially as regards tax and redistribution, right? So we have the difficult situation where, yes, of course, if the EU basically was in charge or more centrally controlling fiscal policy in the sense that it could do its own tax and redistribution, of course, the effects of an asymmetrical crisis like the Euro crisis would have been better managed. But the problem here is that essentially, precisely because there's a very distinct sense of, precisely because fiscal policy is justified, I think, on the basis of a narrative of who belongs to the community and who as a member of the community deserves redistribution. This is part of the policy that sovereign states are not willing to concede. And we see that specifically with the Euro crisis, we haven't done even the minimum stuff that's required to fully have a functioning Eurozone management. Like, we're still relying on coordination of economic policies with some strict conditions from above, but basically we haven't even been able to agree on a banking union and a true backstop if another crisis comes along. So I would say it's a chicken and an egg problem. I agree with you that yes, you would have more effective management of the crisis, but I just don't know how we get from A to B, which gets me to the question of I have a question to the person, to Daven, I think, who posed the question of why wouldn't a supranationalist vision become more appealing today? And I'm really intrigued by that idea, but I personally just don't see how, even within the current, COVID-19 crisis. Yes, this is a virus that's against everyone. We're all humans and we're likely to be infected. Yes, the EU adopted a 1.8 trillion package, but in the end, basically, the nation states had to haggle over hospital beds and masks and protective equipment in a very tribal way, I think.
All right, those were really good questions, first of all, and not just to me, but to the other panelists as well. And part of me was tempted to just answer those questions instead of the ones posed to me. But let me at least try and answer a couple of the ones that Naomi sent my way. One of them was why Truman did not push more for the question of human rights, and I think that's sort of a common assumption that he didn't, or the administration didn't, but I think they in many respects did. But I think what we have to recognize is that, in stark contrast to what happened to the United Nations, by the time they found it, the Americans in particular, are of the belief that this is going to work just like the American Constitution. That is to say, it's not an imperfect document. It's not expected to be a perfect document in the beginning. It's going to grow. And so they operate with this assumption, literally, that when we convene in September 1945, or January as it becomes, human rights is going to be one of the first things we're going to discuss and agree upon. And that never really materializes. And part of the problem, of course, was that they had actually created a charter that was extraordinarily difficult to actually ratify. It only works if the member states, and particularly permanent members, are interested in ratification. And at some level, it should have been clear that particularly the Soviets, as was pointed out, were not that interested, and neither were the British. But at the end of the day, when it comes to San Francisco and before, the reason that they are willing to compromise, the reason that they feel the need to compromise, is they fear the other powers are going to walk away. And they do not believe that you can have a United Nations without the British Empire, as it effectively would be, and the Soviet Union. And so they assume that there's going to be a path forward, and that never materializes. I would add, though, that part of the reason why it doesn't materialize is also Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The acquisition of the atomic bomb so dramatically alters this sense of equality between nation states that Americans have spent so much time talking about, and which, in fairness, none of the people in the State Department knew in 1942 or 1943 was actually a thing, right? So there are sort of different aspects going on here. And perhaps had they been able to find an agreement over the question of nuclear energy and nuclear weaponry, maybe, but it seems doubtful that the other powers would have been interested in the kind of Bill of Rights Americans were imagining. And so the issue never really reemerges. And that's why we end up instead with 1948, right? Which, as I said, we can sort of hail as this moment of grand, wonderful principles that only concern nation states effectively, right? That is to say, they're all about citizens inside their own countries, and we tell states you should really live up to this, and that's wonderful. And when they don't, there's absolutely nothing the institution can do about it, or the rest of us can do about it, which is probably why we get the sort of lopsided 48-0 vote on the declaration, right? With a string of nations abstaining. It was perhaps the most legitimate thing the Soviets ever did, was to abstain from voting for it, at least. That was the rarity in their case. And that's sort of a different question that came up was about 1948 and whether it was corporate interest. There was some, but I think to a much greater extent, it reflected the fact that in 1948, the world had moved on. Whatever opportunity existed during the war had simply vanished. It was now a world of powerful nation states that didn't trust each other that much, and certainly did not trust an international organization that much, that was subjected to vetoes and veto threats at a constant level. And so we end up with this organization where we can agree on all these principles, but put no enforcement mechanisms in place, which is probably why we agreed on all the principles. It usually is. Let me just go back for the last couple of minutes, sort of to one of the questions that were addressed to all of us. Why don't we hear about this? Why don't we hear about this sort of conversation to Tiziana's point about federalism? Why is that not part of the curriculum, if you will? I guess that's sort of the question, right? And I think part of the reason for that is that it fails, right? That it sort of peters out, and instead we end up with this enormously powerful story about the Second World War and the immediate post-war order that becomes about the Cold War. It's extraordinarily uninspiring, I guess, and I'm saying this as someone who does it for a living, to spend your research on something that didn't work, right? But I think that's part of the narrative. That is to say that the reason why those of us who sort of have some affinity for world federalism and stuff like that, the reason we're a really small group is because a lot of other people just have never taken the interest. And so it doesn't materialize as part of the American conversation about the Second World War or even the Cold War, which I think is also why we misunderstand a lot about the early Cold War and why that breaks out. And in fairness, I would add that I think the Truman administration does a lot in its own way to make sure of that, because their narrative by the late 1940s becomes the Soviets are evil and they've always been evil, and we never had any intent of working with them. But that intent was actually there, right? There's a reason why we wrote the Soviets into Bretton Woods in 1944. We expect them to sign on. It's only at the very end of December 1945 that they walk away from that project. And that would have helped create that sort of unity, at least among the major powers in the world, and that never materializes. I think I'm just about out of time, Naomi. I think I got to most of the questions.
Brilliantly done in terms of timing. And Tiziana would like to say one thing, and I thought I will let her have the floor, and then I want to just add one last comment. Tiziana.
Oh yeah, thank you. So following up on what Michael said, I completely agree. One consideration when I'm studying these things, what I noticed are two things. On the one side, the Federalist culture completely died out. It completely died out of academia. Academia does not discuss that, is not aware of that. I have a lot of conversations with people that have a lot of insights in World War II, and they know nothing about it. They admit that they do not know nothing. They are interested in knowing more. They would like to know more. They would like to support the idea because they see the validity of the question and the validity for the current world order, reforming of the current world order. Second thing that happened, as a result of that, there are no categories of analysis that would allow us to look at these problems from a Federalist perspective. Therefore, that perspective is completely eschewed. And so we keep hearing back and back again the isolationist internationalist, or the UN as this great success of internationalism. And so because that culture died out, it's very difficult now to reinstate it within academia and within public discourse as a valid question and a valid perspective to look at things, both in terms of research and analysis and also in terms of valid solutions to some of the problems that we're seeing today for world order, international organizations, and all the threats that we are facing today. So that is my contribution to that part of the discussion.
Thank you so much. And we are at time, and I thought that I would leave us with a comment contributed in the chat by Mark Dick, just to tie this conversation back to a conversation that happened yesterday, and the idea of giving the UN Parliamentary Assembly one topic to deal with, and an important one, a carbon tax to influence the growing climate crisis. And the suggestion that maybe starting small in global governance, but focusing on one idea and a central and important political idea might be the way to go. I'm going to leave it there as sort of food for thought, and I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking the panelists.